Hello there and welcome to the real world industry analysis for the May MCS sitting in 2019 for Jord Homes, the prefabricated house manufacturer. So with that tongue twister said, let's discuss what this document, or video rather, is and what the document is. The document is a standalone product. This video does not replace it. We're going to go through it overview wise, like sort of brief descriptions, discussing some of the overarching points, but the detail is going to be all within a document. So if you do have the time in your study schedule, feel free to have a look through this for a little of extra context, but we will go over the major points as we see fit. So we're going to start off with what our role is and how we're going to use this analysis. Well, in terms of our role, we are the finance manager and we work for the finance director. So we have that direct link to a more strategic position, which is very, very important. As you see, strategic management has got some delegations to us, which is actually quite appropriate because the industry becomes more and more relevant the more sort of strategic you go in terms of thinking. And importantly, we do liaise with colleagues from other functional areas such as production, sales, marketing and human resources. So our role is very broad. That means that this analysis is going to try and inform us on the trends and sort of events as far as the industry is concerned for these different categories like production, marketing, HR, like are there any staffing issues, industrial action, etc. Likewise, the strategic elements will be very useful because it will help us inform us about where we need to go as Jord Homes for growth. So with that said, we're going to scroll down to the history page, or history section rather. It's going to introduce us to prefab buildings. So the first and foremost thing is, what is a prefab building? Well, it's a building or objects that are built from parts that are made in a factory and can then be put together quickly. You'll notice this is quite a broad description, and ultimately they can come in many different forms. We saw in the pre-scene that Jord have built a hotel this way, but they do specialise in house manufacturing. The history does date back all the way to the 11th century, where castles were moved by horse and cart, but we will ignore that because we only care for the modern history, and that begins with the post-war period. And this is because many homes were destroyed after the war, or during the World War, and a lot of troops needed to be quickly accommodated in different areas of the world for the different war fronts. But importantly, this generated a huge demand during and after the war. They were typically seen, or projected rather, to have a lifespan of 5 to 10 years. However, many ended up surviving into the early 2000s when the UK government in particular started knocking them down. But the residents actually really enjoyed them, which is quite a surprise because they weren't built to last. Which is actually quite a surprise because they were not built to last, but they ended up standing for a long time, for over 60 years, and that is very, very impressive given that they weren't actually designed to do so. And this has led to technological advances and other sort of manufacturing techniques that have helped prefabs become a solution for modern housing shortages. And we see a lot of different sort of building sites being done in this way now, especially where there is a lack of housing or infrastructure. In particular, the NHS in the UK have been a very popular proponent of this method, and they've had several buildings developed and constructed by Premier Modular, which is a UK-based prefab company using CAD and CAM software. On top of this, we now have today a more trendy option in a custom-built home centered around sustainability and looking pretty awesome, essentially, is the overall gist of things. So we've got a aesthetically popular option for homeowners that's also sustainable, which also means they pay less in their energy bills over time because they're using less energy as part of heating or cooling down the house, for example. So this is kind of where the history has led to. We're now in a stage where both housing shortages in affordable homes are being used, as well as these very, very grand designs-esque from the TV show, that kind of high-end premier building is being achieved as well, and are very, very popular and increasing in popularity. So what types of fabricated building are there? Well, the first and foremost, the original, if you will, are manufactured homes. And these are essentially entirely built in a factory. They're put together in a factory as well. And as you can see in the image, they are taken on lorries to the site and just placed on the foundation. They're made with a steel frame, and ultimately they're not as good as the alternatives, but they were the kinds of homes that we found after the World War, and also they can be found sometimes on campsites currently because they do serve a purpose. They're just not particularly nice. They're not sort of at the level that a government's going to pay for thousands of these to be used anymore. Likewise, the other options such as modular are just far more efficient. And modular is essentially where whole rooms are built in a factory and then they're put together like Lego bricks. So this is the most popular method at the moment because it is the most efficient and it has the most CAD and CAM applications, which means that there's more design elements you can change in those modules. But there's also panels, and these are the most aesthetically pleasing option. You can do a lot with custom built panels, and these are similar to modular, except they don't build whole rooms in the factory. They build the different walls in the factory and then slot them together like a jigsaw as opposed to Lego bricks. So if you imagine that, you're putting the 4 walls together and then more walls on top of that or next to that, depending on the house structure, and eventually you get your whole house. And because of the way they're done, they essentially have more design space for having like these trendy applications. Because you're only designing one wall at a time, they don't need to be sort of constructed in a factory setting as a room immediately. They can be done, on the site as different walls, which helps that option. So what are the applications for Jord? Well, the first thing is that we're established after the World War, so we don't have a history of doing manufactured buildings. We've never had that in the company, I imagine, and this means that we can explain our focus on quality by our kind of start date. We've started at a point where prefab has been growing as a sort of expertise and developing as an overall technique to build homes with. So we're not stuck in the past, essentially. Likewise, we can see that the reference to timber frames means that we do not do manufactured buildings as well. We know that for sure because those are steel frame buildings. I do not believe they can be done with timber frame in that kind of way. So we don't really have that in our product range, which is a good thing because they're not particularly high quality. It would be a strange thing for us to do. And finally, the main benefit of prefab buildings is speed and lower cost. However, Jord are a luxury brand, so it's a little bit of an awkward fit as far as the demand for affordable housing goes, and there is that question of strategically pivoting towards having that mass appeal of producing affordable homes. So demographically, it's a bit awkward, but Corvola is very prosperous, which suggests that perhaps we can get away with it, essentially. And now we get to the industry examples, and this is the big thing for your exam. Of course, is how we integrate this industry information. We won't go over all of them, but there are 25 here, so there's plenty for you to get inspiration from, but we'll go over the first 3 to be useful and helpful to discuss how they work. And ultimately you want to quote relevant industry examples in an analysis paragraph. So let's have a look at issue number 1. I did allude to this one earlier. Amazon invested venture capital into a company called Plant Prefab, which are a prefab manufacturer in California, I believe. And essentially they have a fund that offers venture capital to anyone trying to push the limits of integrating voice technology and other technologies that Amazon do create rather. And essentially, because Plant Prefab are trying to incorporate voice-enabled technology within the actual home itself, Amazon were very keen to go into like a joint venture / investment project with them, where they've probably acquired some amount of equity in the company. Perhaps it's just a joint venture. I'm not quite sure. It doesn't specify. However, there are a number of opportunities for Jord, and this could be a way in which we fund it by committing to going the extra mile in technology, which is a consumer trend as well as an industry trend, Then you add in the fact that you can acquire funding from it, and it becomes very, very popular, or very appealing rather. So a sample exam paragraph may look like this. So our first line is referencing some sort of imaginary context that I've made up. So of course, for Jord to meet the housing demand in Korvola, we will need funding. So this is basically talking about the opportunity to grow via making houses that are affordable in Korvola. Whether that's appropriate is, irrelevant for this example. This is clearly situated in a context where we've accepted this route. So if we're doing this, then we need funding. And one such way is to attract investment from another sector, such as technology. Amazon invested in plant prefab via the Lex Fund, etc. So it's about analyzing and then providing a paragraph that backs it up, that justifies, or it could just be a small point, as seen with, or for example, this. It doesn't need to be pretty long actually, as we do recommend that most paragraphs are 4 to 6 lines. So this is kind of the right length if you're doing a larger point. If you're doing a smaller point, an example may not be appropriate, or you may want to make it very brief, such as Jord will need funding for this. One route is the technology sector. There are companies such as Amazon investing. So, for example, look at their investment in prefab via the Alexa Fund. Done. It's very brief, just to make sure that we are covering ourselves, adding that extra bit of quality. Because remember, there are integration marks in the MCS. I believe there is 3 to 5. It differs between the different case studies, so I may be mistaken on the exact number, but it's fairly significant amount of marks, and the way in which they are decided is entirely discretionary to the examiner. Sorry, that was a difficult word for me. And essentially, it's about how well have you incorporated the required pillars. So if one question wants you to do E2 and F2 knowledge, it wants to understand, the marks rather are handed out depending on how well you've put those things together and mixed them. On top of this, just overall, how good was the question? So if you've got one question where you haven't put any examples and one that's identical but with examples, well, the one with examples will get more integration marks. So do be aware that it is a nice way to pick up extra marks. Next up, we see that bribery is a big deal, especially in developed countries as well. So it's not just developing countries such as Lesotho, it's also in London. So we cannot escape this. Korvola are definitely an area where this could happen. And essentially, the issue, of course, is ethics, and we need to make sure our culture is okay. But a sample exam paragraph would look something like, given that the Korvolan government are offering contracts, or offering large contracts rather, it makes sense to tender an offer based on the above reasons. So this is the context where we're referring back to our overall answer. And ultimately, this is how we should always answer our questions, always having a reference to the question or a reference to where we're at as far as the discussion is. So if we've already described why we should tender an offer, we can then talk about the risks or the drawbacks. And there is a serious consideration that we must take as an organisation. Given the high competition for these contracts, there may be a temptation to offer bribes to senior officials in order to secure them. And then we can add our example in this space here. That's quite a long paragraph, so I haven't added it there. But if it's a very big part of a question, and it could be, then you do want to add that example on the end. So now let's take a look at the final example for this video, but there is 25 remaining, or 22 remaining, 25 total for you to have a look at. And this one is again about occupational injuries and health and safety, but importantly about wearable tech. Again, it's one of those things that I think could come up in the exam just because it's so useful. It helps two risks, staff and health and safety, and it sort of helps the brand. If I saw builders wearing like fancy smart caps that measured their fatigue, I'd be like, whoa, that company's got stuff going on. So with that in mind, it helps the brand a little bit as well, because we're investing as much as possible in every aspect. The relevance, of course, is to our health and safety standards as well as our staff motivation. And an example would be CSR is an important aspect for any company, but more so for us as a luxury brand. For this reason, I recommend we should cater our approach to our staff by investing in wearable tech to show them we care deeply about their safety. This would, limit our risks to both staff leaving and health and safety. And on top of this, we can see this in the US, where 250 billion a year is lost. So your example goes here in this space, and then you've got a nice, very well-rounded paragraph to get marks from. For example, if you look at this one, without the example, it's 3 and a little bit lines. But with the example, you're getting to 4 to 6, and that's great. So with that in mind, it's very, very important to try and work these in. It's not necessary, but it's good for your marks to do so. Now, with that said, that brings us to the end of the industry video. I hope you found it very useful, but just a reminder, again, this is not a replacement for the document. Feel free to have a look at that. It is very useful in terms of all the information given. But for us here on the video, thank you very much for listening. I hope it helped, and good luck with the studying for your MCS success. Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very, very, very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So, for example, if the pre-scene's on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really, really soon, the master classes are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a master class on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very, very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee, provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilised our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed. We will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.